Picture this. It is 1913. The United States government has just spent 5 years trying to destroy one man's company. The Supreme Court ruled against him. The company was dismantled into 34 separate pieces, scattered like broken glass across the American map. The newspapers celebrated. The editorial pages declared justice served. The reformers who had spent a decade demanding accountability took a moment to breathe and called it a victory. And the man at the center of it all, John Davison Rockefeller, watched his personal fortune triple in 24 months, from $300 million to $900 million. Nearly 3% of everything the United States produced in a single year, sitting in one man's pocket. In terms of what that share of the economy represents in purchasing power today, we are talking about something in the range of $631 billion. That number is from Guinness World Records, not from a Rockefeller family press release. Let that land. The government spent 5 years prosecuting him, won completely, and accidentally made him the richest human being in recorded American history. This is not a story about a robber baron who got away with it. It is more complicated and more interesting than that. This is a story about a boy from a broken home in upstate New York who understood something about efficiency, scale, and the nature of industrial organization that nobody else in his generation could fully see. It is a story about the woman who spent 3 years dismantling his reputation, one document at a time. It is a story about a government crusade that produced the opposite of its intended result. And it is a story about what happens when you build something so large, so integrated, so deeply woven into the fabric of an economy that not even a unanimous Supreme Court ruling can actually stop it. The companies are still running. You probably filled your tank at one of them this week. Before we go back to 1839 and the farm in upstate New York where this whole story starts, drop a comment and tell us where in the world you are watching from right now. We have people watching from every continent, and I genuinely love knowing who is in the room. And if you are new here, subscribe. This story is going to earn it. Richford, New York, 1839, a farm between Binghamton and Ithaca, in the middle of nowhere particular and into a family that was already running from something. John Davison Rockefeller arrived as the second of 6 children on July 8th. His father was William Avery Rockefeller, known throughout the region as Devil Bill. The name was not affectionate. William was a traveling salesman, charming and almost completely dishonest, who made money selling elixirs he claimed could cure cancer and charged $25 a treatment to families desperate enough to believe him. He was gone for months at a time, sometimes for more than a year, appearing and disappearing without notice, carrying cash when he had it and excuses when he did not. He was cheerful about both. In 1849, when John was 10 years old, William was charged with rape. The case never went to court. 6 years later, in 1855, while still legally married to John's mother, William assumed a false identity as Dr. William Livingston and secretly married a second woman in Ontario. He maintained both families for years, crossing between them with the casual ease of a man who believed the rules did not fully apply to him. He would occasionally reappear at the family home in upstate New York with gifts and stories, cheerful and unreliable in equal measure, and he was known to brag that he was trying to cheat his own sons in small transactions, to sharpen them, to make them ready for a world that would try to do the same. John D. Rockefeller spent his entire adult life trying to pretend this man was not his father. His mother, Eliza Davison Rockefeller, was the other half of the equation. Devout Baptist, strict to the point of severity, she ran the household with a discipline that was the exact opposite of William's chaos. She managed money with the focused intensity of someone who understood it could disappear at any moment, because in her household it frequently did. She instilled 3 things in John that never left him: work hard, save everything, and give 10%. He carried those principles from his first 50-cent-a-day job through the accumulation of $900 million without a single year of exception. The tithing started before the money did. As a boy, John was serious in the way some children are serious. Not unhappy exactly, but watching, calculating, keeping track of things adults assumed were too complicated for children to notice. He bought a bag of candy at a store, divided it into individual pieces, and sold them one at a time at a markup to the other children in the neighborhood. He was 9 years old. At 12, he loaned a neighboring farmer $50 at 7% interest, money he had saved himself from small jobs and careful economies. When the farmer repaid him with interest the following spring, Rockefeller later said it was the moment he understood that money could work for you while you slept. That understanding never left him. The family moved repeatedly through upstate New York, chased by Williams scandals and financial reversals, before finally settling near Cleveland, Ohio, in 1853. John was 14. He enrolled in Cleveland schools and began to prepare for a future that had no room in it for the chaos of his father's life. He attended Central High School in Cleveland and excelled at mathematics. He was systematic, methodical, not particularly social. He had a gift for mental calculation, for holding multiple numbers in his head simultaneously and understanding their relationships. His father, in one of his periodic reappearances, told him that college was an unnecessary expense and he should get a job. Rockefeller took a 3-month bookkeeping course and, at 16 years old, began looking for work. He spent 6 weeks making the rounds of Cleveland's commercial houses before securing his first position as an assistant bookkeeper at Hewitt & Tuttle, a merchant firm dealing in produce and commodities. He was paid 50 cents a day, a wage that would rise as he proved himself. He recorded every cent he earned and every cent he spent in a personal ledger he called Ledger A. He maintained this accounting practice for the rest of his life, through the poorest days of his youth and the wealthiest days of his age. The discipline never varied. In 1859, at 19 years old, he formed a commodities trading partnership with a young Englishman named Morris Clark. The partnership, Clark and Rockefeller, dealt in grain, meats, and hay, and in their first year grossed $450,000. It was a remarkable performance for two young men with almost no starting capital. John D. Rockefeller was, by any measure, exceptionally good at commerce. He understood margins, costs, logistics, and the relationships between them with an intuitive precision that his partners found difficult to match. He also had a courtship to conduct that year. He had been spending time with a young woman he had known since high school, a serious, intellectually accomplished woman named Laura Celestia Spellman. Everyone called her Seti. Her father was a committed abolitionist who had operated a station on the Underground Railroad, sheltering escaped slaves at considerable personal risk. John recorded every expenditure of the courtship in his ledger: carriage rides, flowers, lectures, eventually a diamond ring. He would marry her on September 8, 1864. She would prove, by his own repeated statement over the following decades, to be the most important figure in his professional as well as his personal life. That same year, 200 miles to the east in Titusville, Pennsylvania, a man named Edwin Drake drilled the first successful oil well in American history. John D. Rockefeller heard about the Titusville well and did what he always did. He watched carefully, said nothing, and waited until he understood exactly what he was looking at. Cleveland in 1863 was a city intoxicated by oil. The Drake well had opened 4 years of frenzied drilling in western Pennsylvania, and crude oil was pouring out of the ground faster than anyone knew what to do with it. The problem was not finding the oil. The problem was the product it produced. Crude oil in the ground was nearly useless, refined into kerosene. It was a lamp fuel that could replace whale oil and candles, lighting homes and businesses across a country where most working families still went to bed when it got dark. Hundreds of small refineries had sprung up almost overnight in Cleveland, each one racing to process the crude coming out of Pennsylvania by rail and wagon, each one undercutting the next on price, each one a month away from collapse or salvation, depending on weather, railroad rates, and luck. A small refinery could be built for $10,000, a large one for $50,000. The barriers to entry were so low that everyone entered, and the result was savage, wasteful overcompetition. Too many refiners producing more kerosene than the market could absorb at profitable prices. Too much volatility in crude oil supply, which fluctuated wildly depending on how many new wells happened to come in or run dry in any given month. Kerosene cost 58 cents a gallon in 1865, and refiners were still losing money on it at that price because their own costs were so poorly controlled. There was no reliability, no efficiency, no structure. The industry was a scramble. Rockefeller did not see chaos. He saw inefficiency waiting for a solution. In February 1865, at 25 years old, he bought out his partners at auction. He paid $72,500 for the Clark brothers' shares, money he had to borrow heavily to assemble. He later called it the day that determined his career. The moment the gavel came down, something clarified. He was no longer a young man in partnership with other people's opinions and other people's caution. He was in charge of a refinery, and he intended to make it the most efficient and most competitive operation in the industry. He immediately reinvested every dollar of profit back into the business, rather than distributing it as income. He brought in Samuel Andrews, a chemist who had developed a superior refining process that extracted more kerosene per barrel than any competing method. He brought in his brother William, who had the social ease and the financial connections that John lacked. And he brought in Henry Flagler, a brilliantly connected businessman whose relationships with railroad financiers would prove to be worth more than any piece of equipment Rockefeller ever bought. The firm of Rockefeller, Andrews, and Flagler became the largest refinery in Cleveland within 2 years. The reason was not a chemistry breakthrough, though Andrews' process helped. The reason was a discovery that had nothing to do with the refinery at all. Rockefeller understood with a clarity that took him almost no time to reach that oil refining was not really a manufacturing business. It was a logistics business. The product was a commodity. Every refiner made essentially the same kerosene. The company that won would be the one that moved product from Cleveland to consumers at the lowest possible cost, which meant the company that controlled transportation costs controlled the industry. In 1868, he struck a deal with the Lakeshore Railroad, guaranteed 60 carloads of oil per day in exchange for a shipping rate of 42 cents per barrel, a reduction of roughly 71% from the posted rate. His competitors, operating without volume guarantees, paid the full rate. They could not match Standard's delivered price. The structural advantage was established before most of his rivals understood the game had changed. On January 10, 1870, the Standard Oil Company of Ohio was incorporated with $1 million in capital. The founding partners were John D. Rockefeller at 30% of the shares, alongside William Rockefeller, Henry Flagler, Samuel Andrews, Stephen Harkness, and Oliver Bird Jennings. Rockefeller chose the name deliberately. Standard meant standardization of quality, the end of the chaos, the arrival of reliability in a market that had never known it. At its founding, Standard controlled roughly 10% of American oil refining. That was the starting position. It was not intended to be a ceiling. Rockefeller's operating philosophy was not greed in any simple sense. He was not trying to become the richest man in the country. He was trying to impose order on a system he believed was destroying itself through irrational competition. Too many refiners operating at a loss, driving prices down past the point of sustainability, wasting capital and labor in a market that could not support them all. He genuinely believed that the free-for-all structure of the early oil industry was economically destructive to everyone in it, including the producers, the workers, and the consumers. He saw himself as the man positioned to rationalize it. Whether you accept that self-description depends entirely on what happened next. By 1872, Rockefeller had decided that 10% was not nearly enough. January 1st, 1872. Standard Oil tripled its capital overnight, from $1 million to $3.5 million, funded by New York banks and financiers Rockefeller had quietly cultivated over the preceding years. The infusion was not for growth in the ordinary sense. It was preparation for a campaign. In late 1871, the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad had approached a group of large refiners with a proposal. Together, they would form the South Improvement Company, a secret alliance between select railroads and select refiners that would restructure the economics of the entire industry in their favor. The railroads would raise their posted shipping rates for everyone. But South Improvement members would receive a rebate on their own shipments and, critically, an additional drawback payment for every barrel their competitors shipped. The official rate from Cleveland to New York would be set at $2.56 per barrel. South Improvement members would pay an effective rate of $1.50. For every barrel their competitors shipped at the full rate, South Improvement members would receive $1.06 on top of that. The railroads would also provide South Improvement members with detailed reports on competitor shipping volumes, giving them a complete real-time picture of independent operations. Rockefeller joined. The scheme was, in its engineering, a masterwork of structural elimination. It did not require Rockefeller to do anything aggressive or visible. The rate structure alone would have made it economically impossible for any independent refiner to survive more than a few months. The independents would either sell to Standard Oil at whatever price Rockefeller offered, or watch their businesses drain away at a rate they could not match and could not even fully explain. On February 26, 1872, news of the rate changes leaked into the Pennsylvania oil regions before the scheme could be quietly implemented. 3,000 people crowded into the Titusville Opera House in a meeting that lasted for hours. Standard Oil signs were defaced across the oil regions. Death threats arrived by mail at Rockefeller's Cleveland office. The Pennsylvania legislature revoked the South Improvement Company's charter on April 2, 1872. It had never shipped a single barrel of oil. The public treated the charter revocation as a decisive victory. The public was not watching closely enough. While the fury over the South Improvement scheme occupied every newspaper editorial and town hall meeting in the oil regions of Pennsylvania, Rockefeller had already moved. Between mid-February and mid-March 1872, in approximately 6 weeks, he and Flagler acquired 22 of the 26 remaining Cleveland oil refineries. The campaign was methodical. Rockefeller would request a meeting with a competitor and open Standard's books fully to them. The competitor would see the actual railroad rates Standard was paying, would see the efficiency figures, the cost per barrel, the margins, would understand in the most concrete possible terms that in a direct competition with Standard Oil, as currently constituted, they would be ground into nothing, regardless of how well they ran their own operation. The system was stacked in Standard's favor at the foundational level, and then Rockefeller would make an offer. The offers were frequently structured as Standard Oil stock rather than cash, which was significant in 2 ways. It meant the sellers did not have to accept a cash payment that might feel like defeat. And it meant that those who accepted became partial owners of the company that was absorbing them, growing wealthy as Standard grew. Those who refused the offer found something troubling. Cleveland's banks, with which Rockefeller had cultivated careful relationships over years by offering equity positions to key bankers and board members, would not extend capital to refiners trying to compete against Standard. The independent operators were isolated. Former competitors who later described the experience used words like thunderstruck when they saw Standard's books, most sold. Rockefeller consolidated 24 Cleveland refineries into 6 state-of-the-art facilities. The rest were demolished, their equipment scrapped or absorbed. He had transformed a chaotic regional market into a controlled industrial operation in 6 weeks, and he had done it primarily by showing people the numbers rather than threatening them. The result was the same either way. Among the refineries caught in the path of this campaign was one connected to the family of a Pennsylvania oil man named Franklin Tarbell. His daughter was 14 years old in 1872. Her name was Ida. She was watching everything. She would remember all of it, and she would come back with a notebook. By 1879, just 7 years after the Cleveland campaign, Standard Oil controlled 90% of American oil refining. What followed that milestone was not further expansion in the ordinary sense. It was architecture. By the early 1880s, there was no honest word for what Standard Oil had become, except enormous. On January 2, 1882, Rockefeller's lawyers completed a new legal structure that would become one of the most consequential organizational innovations in the history of American capitalism. The stockholders of 41 companies conveyed their shares to 9 trustees, with Rockefeller among them. Each stockholder received trust certificates in return, entitling them to a proportional share of all dividends from the pooled enterprise. The Standard Oil Trust was valued at $70 million at its formation. It was the first great corporate trust in American history, and its organizational logic was immediately studied and replicated by industries across the country. Steel trusts, sugar trusts, copper trusts, whiskey trusts. Standard Oil had not merely built a company, it had invented a legal template for concentrated industrial power, and that template spread through the American economy like a design that everyone had been waiting for. At the trust's peak, the numbers require patience and repetition to fully absorb. 20,000 domestic oil wells, either owned or contractually controlled. 4,000 miles of pipeline connecting wellheads to refineries and refineries to ports and rail depots, making Standard Oil one of the largest single engineering enterprises in the world at that moment. 5,000 tank cars moving product across the national rail network. Over 100,000 employees spread across the full vertical structure of the enterprise. By 1904, Standard controlled 91% of American oil refining and 85% of final consumer sales in the United States. Set aside what those numbers mean as a monopoly for a moment and consider what they mean as a physical fact. 91% of everything refined, 85% of everything sold at the end of the chain. This was not a company with a dominant position in its market. This was the market. What Standard actually constructed, beyond the market percentages, tends to get lost in discussions of the monopoly because the monopoly is the easier story. But the physical and technical achievement was staggering in its own right. Rockefeller's organization found 300 distinct uses for each barrel of crude oil, turning what competitors discarded into product lines. Petroleum jelly sold commercially as Vaseline. Paraffin wax for food preservation and candle making. Lubricating oils for the machinery of an industrializing America that consumed them at a rate that would have seemed impossible a decade earlier. Industrial chemicals, anesthetics, compounds that the American pharmaceutical and manufacturing industries would build entire supply chains around. Rockefeller's organization was among the first in American industry to hire full-time research chemists whose only job was to find more value in the barrel. He developed proprietary processing methods for high-sulfur crude that every other refiner classified as unusable waste and discarded. He built his own tank cars rather than lease them from the railroads, built his own docking and storage facilities at ports, built his own barrel-making plants at each stage of the supply chain where an independent contractor or middleman had previously extracted a margin. Rockefeller installed standard infrastructure and eliminated the cost. The result was a vertically integrated system that could sell kerosene cheaper than any competitor could produce it. The kerosene price is the number that most directly answers the question of whether Standard Oil's dominance helped or hurt ordinary Americans. 58 cents a gallon in 1865. 26 cents by 1870, the year Standard was founded. 9 cents by 1880. 6 cents by 1897. Before Standard Oil created reliable, affordable kerosene distribution, nighttime illumination was a genuine luxury. Whale oil and tallow candles cost enough that most working-class families in America went to bed when the sun went down. Reading at night, working at night, anything that required light after dark was a privilege of the prosperous. By the 1880s, a working-class household could light their home for 1 cent per hour. Rockefeller called it the poor man's light, and the phrase was not marketing. It was accurate. His critics argued, and still argue, that prices would have fallen further and faster under genuine competitive conditions, that the monopoly extracted rents from consumers that real competition would have eliminated. His defenders argued that no competitive market could have built the pipeline infrastructure, the distribution network, the research laboratories, or the economies of scale that made those prices achievable at all. Both arguments have merit. The historical debate has not been resolved and probably cannot be. What is not disputed is the direction and the magnitude of the change. By 1896, Rockefeller had stopped going to the office daily. In 1897, at 58 years old, he formally retired and handed day-to-day management to John Dustin Archbold, who had been his most trusted operational deputy for years. Rockefeller remained the largest shareholder and nominal president. But the decisions that followed, the pricing strategies, the competitive conduct, the further acquisitions, those belonged to Archbold. This timing would become crucial to any honest assessment of Rockefeller's legacy. The most aggressive and legally questionable behaviors that appeared in the antitrust case against Standard Oil were conducted under Archbold's management in the years after Rockefeller had stepped away from the building. Rockefeller would receive every bit of the blame regardless. He was on the golf course at Pocantico Hills, handing out dimes and funding universities, while the organization he had built continued operating under his name and his shadow. And in Pennsylvania, a woman was opening her notebooks. Ida Minerva Tarbell was born in 1857 in a log cabin in Hatch Hollow, in the oil country of western Pennsylvania. 2 years before Edwin Drake drilled the first successful well 2 counties over. She grew up in Titusville. Her father, Franklin Tarbell, had built his livelihood in the independent oil community, in the world of small operators and local refiners that Rockefeller's consolidation had systematically absorbed or destroyed. Ida had watched that process from childhood. The atmosphere, she later described in her writing, was one of hate, suspicion, and fear that had settled over the community like weather. Neighbors who had invested in oil businesses watched those investments collapse. Men who had believed they were building something lasting watched it be bought or broken. Her father's business had been among those damaged. This was not a grievance she arrived at through investigation. It was the air she had breathed from the time she could form memories. She studied biology at Allegheny College. One of the few women in her class graduated in 1880, worked briefly as a teacher, and then decided that academic and classroom life was not what she wanted. She went to Paris to pursue journalism, writing for American magazines on a freelance basis, learning her craft in the way young writers of that era learned it, by doing it relentlessly, with minimal financial cushion. She came to the attention of Samuel McClure, the brilliantly restless founder and editor of McClure's magazine, who brought her onto the staff in 1894. Under McClure, the magazine was becoming something important, a platform for long-form investigative journalism aimed at a general audience that was beginning to notice how much concentrated power had accumulated in American industry during the decades since the Civil War. Tarbell's series on Napoleon ran to several installments and demonstrated that she could sustain a complex narrative across months of publication. Her Lincoln biography series was even more successful, doubling McClure's circulation and establishing her as one of the most widely read journalists in the country. By 1900, she and the editors at McClure's were looking for their next major subject. The conversation about Standard Oil developed over months. They considered the Steel Trust and the Sugar Trust. They recognized that Standard Oil was different in scale, in reach, in the depth of public resentment it had generated among the communities it had affected. And Tarbell had her own reasons, rooted in her own history, for wanting to understand exactly what had happened and how it had been done. She spent 3 years on the investigation before the first word appeared in print. The research was exhaustive in a way that was unusual even for serious journalists of that period. She went through every congressional hearing in which Standard Oil had been examined, which by the early 1900s included substantial testimony from multiple investigations. She worked through court documents and the internal company correspondence that had surfaced in various state and federal legal proceedings over the years. She tracked down former Standard employees and former competitors. Then, through an introduction arranged with characteristically oblique assistance from Mark Twain, she gained access to Henry H. Rogers, one of Standard Oil's most powerful senior executives, the man who managed much of the trust's financial and operational strategy. Rogers agreed to meet with her. He spoke with her over approximately 2 years of periodic interviews. He provided documents. He explained in considerable detail how the railroad rebate structure had worked, how competitors had been approached and absorbed, how the South Improvement Scheme had been designed. He was either convinced she was writing something favorable or convinced that Standard Oil's story could withstand scrutiny or simply susceptible to the attention of a brilliant journalist. By the time he understood what she was building, she had already extracted the complete interior architecture of Standard Oil's methods from the man who was third in the company's operational hierarchy. Between November 1902 and the end of 1904, Tarbell's investigation ran in 19 installments in McClure's magazine. Each issue sold out faster than the last. The accumulated series was published as a 2-volume book in 1904 under the title The History of the Standard Oil Company. It became a national bestseller. A jury of leading American journalists convened in 2003 to rank the greatest works of American journalism in the 20th century, placed it 5th on the list, above almost every investigation conducted in the 100 years that followed. The book documented the railroad rebate system with documentary precision, showing exactly how the rate structures had worked and who had approved them. It reconstructed the South Improvement Company in full. It laid out the sequence of the Cleveland acquisitions with names, dates, purchase prices, and the names of the bankers who had declined to finance the holdouts. It was not an opinion piece. It was a prosecutorial document assembled with the rigor of a legal brief. Rockefeller's response was silence. He had maintained a strict no talking to the press policy for decades, a discipline he had held to through years of critical coverage and never broken. He privately called Tarbell a poisonous woman and instructed his advisors not to engage with her work publicly. The policy was, in the context of what she was publishing, strategically catastrophic. Every devastating claim sat in the national record without rebuttal. Every accusation accumulated credibility with each month that passed without a substantive response from the company or the man. Rockefeller's silence was interpreted, not unreasonably, as the silence of a person who could not answer the charges. The most powerful industrial organization in American history was being methodically dismantled in print, and the man who built it had decided that dignity required silence. There was one wound in the investigation that operated at a different register from the rest. Tarbell's research had surfaced the full story of William Rockefeller, Devil Bill, still alive somewhere in the country under his false identity, still operating as the bigamist and accused criminal whose history John D. had spent his entire adult life managing at a careful distance. That story was now in the national press, in detail, attributed with documentation. The wall John had built between himself and his father's crimes had been knocked down with a precision that only someone who had grown up watching those crimes' consequences could have achieved. President Theodore Roosevelt had been reading every installment. Roosevelt became president in September 1901 following McKinley's assassination in Buffalo. He was 42 years old, the youngest man to hold the office in American history at that point, and he arrived with a set of beliefs about concentrated industrial power that had been forming for years. He had watched the merger wave of the 1890s consolidate major sectors of the American economy into a small number of giant trusts and holding companies. He believed this concentration was not merely an economic problem, but a political one, that organizations accumulating the kind of power Standard Oil had accumulated were capable of corrupting democratic institutions and democratic elections in ways that went beyond ordinary market competition. Between 1901 and 1909, Roosevelt's Justice Department filed 44 antitrust suits against various combinations and trusts across the American economy. Standard Oil was not the first target. After Tarbell's series generated the kind of concentrated national anger that makes certain actions politically unavoidable, it moved to the top of the list. In November 1906, the Justice Department filed suit against Standard Oil of New Jersey under the Sherman Antitrust Act, the 1990 statute that prohibited combinations in restraint of trade. The government's case was built substantially on the evidence Tarbell had assembled and published: secret railroad rebates, the drawback payment system that directed competitor shipping revenue to Standard's accounts, the deliberate acquisition campaign that had eliminated the independent refining industry. Standard Oil's defense was not entirely without merit. The company's lawyers argued that bulk shipping discounts were commercially rational arrangements available to any shipper who could provide sufficient guaranteed volume, that the acquisitions of competitors had been voluntary transactions at prices the sellers had accepted, that consumer prices for kerosene had fallen dramatically and continuously through Standard's years of dominance, that the American economy had benefited from the integration and efficiency Standard's organization had achieved. The arguments were not fabrications. They described real aspects of what Standard Oil had actually done. The courts had to decide which aspects of the conduct the law required them to weigh most heavily. During the 5 years the case worked its way through the federal courts toward the Supreme Court, Rockefeller's health deteriorated under the accumulated stress. He had first experienced a serious physical breakdown in the early 1890s, when the pressure of managing Standard Oil and fighting the initial round of state antitrust challenges had produced what his doctors described as a systemic collapse. He had developed alopecia universalis, the most complete form of the condition, losing every hair on his body, including his eyebrows and eyelashes. He had been ordered by his physicians to retire or face consequences. They declined to specify precisely, but described as severe. He had retired. His health had recovered. But the alopecia had never reversed, and the antitrust battle reopened the stress that had produced it. He had 3 wigs made at different lengths so he could rotate them and give the impression to those who saw him infrequently that his hair was growing and being trimmed at normal intervals. He wore the wigs to church and to golf and apparently, according to family accounts, to bed. He accepted the situation with what those who observed him described as equanimity so complete it was difficult to distinguish from indifference. He played golf. He gave away money. He retreated to Pocantico Hills, the large estate in Westchester County, New York, that he had been assembling since the late 1880s, and let his lawyers work. On May 15, 1911, Chief Justice Edward White delivered the Supreme Court's unanimous opinion. Standard Oil of New Jersey had used secret railroad rebates, predatory pricing, and a sustained and deliberate campaign of competitor acquisition and elimination to build and maintain an illegal monopoly in restraint of trade. The company had 6 months to divide itself into separately owned and independently operated entities. 34 new companies, separated primarily by geography, were to emerge from the dissolution. The ruling also established the rule of reason as the governing standard in American antitrust law, holding that only unreasonable restraints of trade violated the Sherman Act. This framework, introduced in White's opinion to prevent the act from being applied to every ordinary business agreement in the economy, is still the primary analytical standard that American courts apply to antitrust cases today. The public celebrated. Tarbell's work had been vindicated at the highest judicial level. Theodore Roosevelt, who by that point had left office and was preparing his Bull Moose campaign, received the news as confirmation that the antitrust crusade had been worth conducting. The editorial pages of every major newspaper declared the end of the Standard Oil era. On the day the Supreme Court ordered the end of Standard Oil, John D. Rockefeller was on the golf course at Pocantico Hills. He finished his round, received the news from an aide, and expressed no visible distress. He knew something the newspapers did not. Here is the number that explains everything. At the moment the Supreme Court ruled against Standard Oil in May 1911, John D. Rockefeller was worth approximately $300 million. That figure appeared in the newspaper coverage of the ruling. It was the number the public understood to represent his fortune. It was about to become almost irrelevant to his actual financial situation. Rockefeller owned approximately 25% of Standard Oil of New Jersey at the time of the dissolution. Under the breakup order, he received 25% of the shares in each of the 34 new companies. This was the direct mechanical consequence of the legal dissolution. Every stockholder in the original trust received their proportional share of each successor company. The arithmetic was straightforward. What was not straightforward was what happened when those shares began trading publicly. Before the dissolution, all of Standard Oil's assets had been bundled inside a single private trust that did not trade on any public exchange and issued no public financial reports. The internal finances of Standard Oil were among the most closely held secrets in American business. Nobody outside the 9 trustees and a small circle of advisors knew with any precision what the individual pieces of the operation were worth. The trust's publicly reported valuation of $70 million, established at its formation in 1882, had not been substantially revised in 30 years, despite decades of growth. The true asset value was hidden. When 34 independently operating companies began trading on public exchanges, the market had the opportunity, for the first time, to look directly at what those assets were actually worth. The market was astonished by what it found. The combined market capitalization of the Standard Oil successor companies within 2 years of the dissolution was dramatically higher than the trust had ever been formally valued. Assets that had been invisible to outside investors inside the opaque trust structure were now visible, analyzable, and valued by a market that recognized major industrial enterprises when it encountered them. Capital from investors who had never been able to buy into Standard Oil directly now poured into the successor companies. Share prices rose sharply across the group. 25% of 34 rising independent companies, it turned out, was worth considerably more than 25% of one static private trust. Rockefeller's $300 million in May 1911 became approximately $900 million by the end of 1913. 24 months. His fortune tripled entirely because the government had forced the hidden value of his assets into public view. He had not made an additional investment. He had not developed a new product. He had not built anything. The government had done it for him. Consider what $900 million represented in 1913. The gross domestic product of the United States that year was approximately $39 billion. Rockefeller's personal fortune equaled nearly 3% of everything the American economy produced in an entire year. By the measure of economic share, the ratio of one person's wealth to the total size of the economy they inhabit, there is no American fortune, before or since, that comes close. Theodore Roosevelt, who had championed the antitrust crusade and done more than any other political figure to make the dissolution possible, reportedly responded to reports of Rockefeller's tripled fortune with the observation, "No wonder Wall Street's prayer now is, 'Oh, merciful Providence, give us another dissolution.'" The greatest antitrust victory in American legal history had accidentally generated the greatest private fortune in American history. Both things were simultaneously, uncomplicatedly true. The wealth continued growing. Standard's successor companies had been built on kerosene, and kerosene was still their primary product in 1911. But a development that had been gathering momentum since 1908 was about to restructure the entire basis of the business. Henry Ford had introduced the Model T in that year, priced at $850 and designed to be the first automobile affordable to a working-class American family. By 1915, 2.5 million of them were on American roads. Gasoline, which in the earliest decades of the oil industry had been a waste byproduct of kerosene refining, a flammable nuisance that Standard's refineries burned in their own boilers, or in earlier years discharged directly into rivers, was becoming the most economically consequential product in the American economy. Rockefeller had not specifically anticipated the automobile era. He had not positioned his companies for it or sought it out. He had simply built an oil distribution infrastructure so complete, so deeply embedded in American geography and commerce, that when the automobile era arrived, it had no choice but to run through the system Rockefeller had built. The gasoline that fueled the 20th century moved through his pipelines, from his refineries to consumers through his distribution networks. In 1916, newspaper headlines announced that John D. Rockefeller had become the first person in American history to accumulate $1 billion. He was 77 years old. He had been trying to give the money away for 60 years. The giving started before the wealth did, which is the detail that most complicates any simple characterization of Rockefeller as merely acquisitive. In 1855, at age 16, John D. Rockefeller recorded his first charitable donation in Ledger A, alongside his first income entries. In 1857, at 18 years old, his total recorded donations came to $28.37. Contributions to his Baptist church, a Catholic orphanage he had no denominational connection to, a mission in Illinois, and a non-sectarian industrial school. He gave to causes that had nothing to do with his own faith community from the beginning, with the same methodical consistency he applied to his accounting. He tithed through his early career, giving 10% of his 50-cent daily wage with the same unwavering discipline he would later apply to 10% of his first million. The proportion never changed, only the amounts changed. The largest single philanthropic commitment of his life came in 1889, when he pledged $600,000 toward the founding of a new university in Chicago, contingent on the city's Baptist community and business leadership raising an additional $400,000. Rockefeller had pictured something relatively modest, a Baptist college of serious academic quality. What emerged under the driving vision of founding President William Rainey Harper was something of an entirely different order. Harper recruited the best scholars available, built research programs from the beginning, rather than adding them to a teaching institution, and established the University of Chicago within a decade as one of the major research universities in the world. Rockefeller had not planned for this. He found himself funding something far larger than he had intended, and he kept funding it because he believed in what it had become. By 1910, he had given the University of Chicago more than $35 million. He later said it was the best investment he ever made. He visited the campus twice in his life, both times with a conspicuously low profile, apparently genuinely uncomfortable with the scale of the institution his money had built. In 1884, he provided a major gift to retire the debt of Atlanta Baptist Female Seminary, a school for African American women founded in Atlanta, Georgia, in the aftermath of the Civil War. His motivation was not abstract. Setty's family, the Spellmans of Ohio, had been committed abolitionists who operated a station on the Underground Railroad at personal risk. Her family represented everything the seminary stood for. The school was eventually renamed Spellman College in honor of her family. Rockefeller paid off the school's entire debt and funded its subsequent growth at a time when such support for black education in the South was neither socially expected nor universally approved among his peers. This was not institutional philanthropy conducted at a distance. This was a direct personal gesture toward the family his wife had come from. His philanthropic advisor, Frederick Taylor Gates, a former Baptist minister who had come to Rockefeller through the University of Chicago project, became perhaps the most consequential single influence on how the fortune was eventually deployed. Gates was intellectually restless and genuinely curious, and he pushed Rockefeller in directions his instincts alone might not have taken him. In 1901, at Gates's sustained urging, Rockefeller established the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research in New York City. The premise was radical for its time. Salaried scientists with no teaching duties, no administrative obligations, and no requirement to justify their research in terms of immediate practical application, simply paid to investigate the causes and mechanisms of disease with whatever method seemed most promising to them. The institution, now called Rockefeller University, became one of the world's great biomedical research centers. Its early investigators helped establish germ theory in American medicine at a time when significant portions of the American medical establishment still resisted the idea that microorganisms caused disease. In 1913, the year Rockefeller's fortune reached $900 million from the dissolution windfall, he established the Rockefeller Foundation with a broad mandate to promote the well-being of humanity throughout the world. He transferred more than $182 million to the foundation during his lifetime. The foundation launched public health campaigns against hookworm, malaria, and yellow fever that operated across the American South, the Caribbean, and eventually in dozens of countries. It funded the reform of medical education in the United States and Canada, supporting the reorganization of medical schools around scientific standards. It supported social science research, international scholarship, and eventually contributed to the establishment of institutions that became predecessors to the World Health Organization. Over the course of his life, John D. Rockefeller gave away approximately $530 million in documented philanthropic gifts. In the same period, his fortune grew from nothing to approximately $1.4 billion at his death, meaning that the giving and the accumulating ran in parallel for his entire adult life, without the giving ever meaningfully reducing the accumulation. He described his approach to wealth not as a tension between acquisition and generosity, but as two expressions of the same obligation. He had been given an unusual talent for making money. The obligation was to exercise that talent fully and then distribute the results wisely. He said so at 18. He was still saying the same thing at 90. The man who had run the largest private organization in human history walked away from it in 1897 at 58 years old, and the transformation in how he presented himself to the world was striking enough that observers who had known him only through newspaper accounts found the reality almost disorienting. His health had been genuinely precarious at the point of retirement. The stress of building and defending Standard Oil through the first wave of antitrust challenges in the early 1890s had produced a full physical collapse that his doctors treated as a near-fatal event. They told him plainly, "Step back from the business or accept the consequences." He stepped back. Within a few years, his energy returned and most of his symptoms resolved. The alopecia never reversed, and he wore those 3 custom wigs for the remainder of his long life, rotating them to simulate the appearance of normal hair growth. He accepted the necessity with what his household staff described as matter-of-fact equanimity. He did not dwell on it. He had other things to do. Cleveland in the 1890s was swept by an enthusiasm for bicycle riding, and Rockefeller, in his mid-50s, embraced it with what Frederick Gates described as boyish abandon. He acquired a collection of riding costumes in various colors, learned to navigate the paths of Forest Hill, his Cleveland country estate, at speeds that alarmed his staff, and spoke about the bicycle with the enthusiasm of someone encountering a genuinely new pleasure for the first time. He took up golf with even greater commitment, playing multiple rounds per week when weather permitted, and continuing to do so well into his 90s. He was methodical about his game, as he was methodical about everything, keeping careful records of his scores and studying his weaknesses with the same analytical attention he had once applied to refinery output. He gave dimes to adults and nickels to children wherever he went, in the cities and on the roads around his estates, pressing the coins into hands with a solemn formality that became both genuine habit and a kind of public performance. He gave dimes to Harvey Firestone, the tire magnate who was worth tens of millions himself, with the same ceremonious gravity he gave them to strangers at the roadside. The gesture was not patronizing. He had always given away money. He was simply doing it now in smaller amounts and at closer range. Seti had been his closest companion through the years of building and fighting and defending the fortune. She had managed their household, raised their children with a frugality deliberately chosen to counteract the corrupting effects of inherited wealth, and provided the counsel that Rockefeller credited, publicly and privately, as the judgment that saved him from his own worst decisions. She had said of their son John Jr. when he was a boy, pressing her for a Christmas present, "I am so glad my son has told me what he wants for Christmas, so now it can be denied him." She was not being cruel. She was building a person. She had been unwell for years, tuberculosis gradually reducing her mobility through the final decade of the century. By 1909, she was confined to a wheelchair. She died on March 12, 1915, at Kaikwit, the main house at their Pocantico Hills estate, of a heart attack. John was in Florida when the telegram arrived and returned to New York immediately. The funeral was attended by family only. He lived 22 more years without her. Those final decades were divided between Pocantico Hills and his winter home in Ormond Beach, Florida, a rambling house called the Casements, set back from the Halifax River. He leaned more heavily on John Jr., who had become his principal partner in philanthropy and family affairs, a serious, dutiful, deeply conscientious man who had been raised on hand-me-down clothes and earned allowances despite growing up as the son of the wealthiest person in the country. The elder Rockefeller remained genuinely active into extreme old age, gardening, attending church, playing golf, pressing coins into hands. Those who met him in his 80s and 90s frequently described the encounter as unexpectedly warm. The grim captain of industry, who had absorbed a continent's worth of refining capacity, was in person a mild and pleasant old man who wanted to show you his garden and give you a dime. John D. Rockefeller died on May 23, 1937, at the Casements in Ormond Beach, of arteriosclerosis. He was 97 years old, 2 months short of the 98th birthday he had told people as a child he intended to reach. He was buried at Lakeview Cemetery in Cleveland, beside Seti, in the city where he had started everything 74 years before. His estate was estimated at approximately $1.4 billion, representing 1.5% of the entire United States economy. His New York Times obituary described it as probably the greatest accumulation of wealth any private citizen had achieved through their own efforts in the history of the world. He had outlived Theodore Roosevelt by 18 years. He had outlived Henry Flagler. He had outlived John Dustin Archbold. He had outlived Henry H. Rogers. He outlived Ida Tarbell by 4 years. She died in 1944. The 34 companies created from Standard Oil's dissolution on May 15, 1911, did not immediately begin competing meaningfully with each other. They had been parts of the same integrated organism for too long. Their management cultures were shaped by the same decades of Standard Oil practice. Their personnel policies, their operational philosophies, their relationships with suppliers and railroad companies reflected 30 years of coordinated strategy. Their largest shareholder, John D. Rockefeller, at approximately 25% of each, was identical across the group. What changed was not the competitive landscape between the successor companies. What changed was their legal structure, their public visibility, and the market's ability to assess their individual worth. Standard Oil of New Jersey became Esso, then Exxon. Standard Oil of New York became Saucony, later Mobil. In 1999, these two companies, separated by the dissolution of 1911 and operating as independent entities for 88 years, were reunited in the largest corporate merger in American history to that point, creating ExxonMobil, the largest investor-owned oil and gas company in the world. Standard Oil of California became Chevron, which absorbed Gulf Oil in 1985 and became the second largest American oil company. Standard Oil of Indiana became Amoco, which was acquired by British Petroleum in 1998. Standard Oil of Ohio was also absorbed into BP through a series of transactions across the 1980s and 90s. Continental Oil became Conoco, now part of ConocoPhillips, one of the largest independent oil companies in the world. And then there is the connection that surprises most people when they encounter it for the first time. Saudi Aramco, the national oil company of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and by many measures the most valuable company on earth, traces its operational origins to a partnership between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Standard Oil of California, formalized in the 1930s when the kingdom was first developing its oil reserves. The technical expertise, the organizational systems, the physical infrastructure that formed the foundation of what became Aramco derived from Standard Oil of California's methods and personnel. Rockefeller's organization, dismantled by the American government in 1911, became the operational template for the oil infrastructure of the Middle East, which would eventually supply the majority of the world's petroleum for the second half of the 20th century. The scale of what the dissolution failed to actually destroy is difficult to state in terms that convey the full reality. Researchers who have tracked the combined capitalization of the Standard Oil successor companies found that in most years between 1913 and the early 21st century, the reconstituted empire considered as a single entity would have ranked as the largest corporation in the world. The government broke it into 34 pieces. The pieces grew. Some merged back together. The underlying assets, the refineries, the pipelines, the distribution networks, the customer relationships continued generating value at the same scale they always had, simply distributed across multiple balance sheets instead of one. The automobile completed what kerosene had started. Gasoline, which Rockefeller's early refineries had burned as fuel for their own boilers or poured into rivers as waste, became the commodity that powered the 20th century. The interstate highway system, commercial aviation, the petrochemical industry, the plastics and synthetic materials that rebuilt the consumer economy after the Second World War. All of it ran on products derived from the same crude oil processing infrastructure whose fundamental logic Rockefeller had established in the 1870s. He had not designed for the automobile age. He had simply built the only oil infrastructure that existed. And when the automobile arrived, it ran through what he had built because there was nothing else to run through. The legal legacy is equally durable. The rule of reason that Chief Justice White embedded in the 1911 ruling is still the framework that American courts apply when evaluating antitrust cases more than 100 years later. The Sherman Antitrust Act. The Federal Trade Commission created in 1914, the Clayton Antitrust Act of the same year, the entire architecture of American competition law was shaped in direct response to the industrial power that Standard Oil had demonstrated was achievable and the abuses that power had enabled. Tarbell's 19-part investigation is still assigned in journalism schools and media programs as the foundational text of the muckraking tradition and the defining example of long-form investigative journalism in American history. Rockefeller and Tarbell are taught together in the same courses, their names inseparable. The adversary and the investigator permanently linked by the story they were each. From opposite positions, the central character of. His son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., continued the philanthropic mission with remarkable personal commitment, giving away more than $500 million of his own fortune over his lifetime. Jr. funded the restoration of colonial Williamsburg, donated the land for the United Nations headquarters in New York City, created Rockefeller Center. His 5 sons, the third generation, entered public life. Nelson became governor of New York and the 41st vice president of the United States under Gerald Ford. David became chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank. Lawrence was a prominent conservationist and venture capitalist. Winthrop served as governor of Arkansas. John III was a leading figure in Asian affairs and philanthropy. The family is now in its 7th generation of organized philanthropy. The Rockefeller Foundation today holds assets of more than $6 billion and has distributed the equivalent of more than $22 billion in today's terms since its founding in 1913 on the proceeds of Standard Oil's dissolution windfall. Standard Oil was not destroyed because John D. Rockefeller was uniquely villainous. The more you hold that sentence in your attention, the more complicated and interesting the story becomes. Lesson 1. Efficiency without ethical boundaries creates the conditions for its own undoing. Standard Oil's core competitive advantage was not fraudulent in its foundation. The railroad bulk rates were commercially rational arrangements available in principle to any shipper who could guarantee sufficient volume. The efficiency gains from vertical integration were genuine. The kerosene price reductions benefited working Americans in concrete and measurable ways. None of that protected Standard Oil from the consequences of the drawback payments that directed competitor shipping revenue into Standard's accounts, the deliberate financial isolation of independent operators who posed no efficiency argument against them, the secrecy maintained around arrangements that could not have survived public examination. Rockefeller believed his mission was so correct, the order he was imposing on a destructive market so genuinely beneficial, that the methods did not require examination or justification. That belief is precisely what produced Ida Tarbell, what produced the antitrust case, and what produced the dissolution. The destination was not enough. The path to it destroyed the enterprise. Lesson 2. Dominance is not permanence. In 1904, Standard Oil controlled 91% of American oil refining. From inside the organization, those numbers must have looked like the end of competition, the arrival of the permanent order Rockefeller had always envisioned. They were not. By 1907, 3 years before the Supreme Court issued its ruling, Standard's market share had already fallen to 68% as competitors who had studied Standard's methods raised capital, partly made available by the public anger Tarbell's investigation had generated, and began replicating the efficiency strategies that had built the monopoly in the first place. The government's victory in 1911 formalized a retreat that was already happening. Dominance creates the illusion of permanence most convincingly for those who have achieved it. It is an illusion. Lesson 3. The organization you hand to someone else will define your legacy more than the organization you built. Rockefeller's most aggressive competitive practices ended when he retired in 1897. Archbold managed the conduct that Tarbell documented and that the government prosecuted. Rockefeller bore the full historical weight of decisions he had not participated in making for years. When you transfer an organization to a successor, you transfer with it the power to write your final chapter. Rockefeller never found a way to separate his name from what Standard Oil became under Archbold's management, and he never stopped being defined by it. Lesson 4. The adversary you decline to engage does not quietly accept being ignored. They find larger audiences. Rockefeller's no-press policy was not a neutral stance. It was an amplifier. 19 consecutive installments of detailed documented accusation sat in the national record without a single substantive rebuttal from the most powerful private organization in the country. Each month of silence was a month in which Tarbell's framing became more authoritative, more settled, more difficult to contest. The man who had built an empire through the ruthless application of information advantages allowed a journalist to define him in public because he believed that engaging with the press was beneath his dignity. Narrative, left unanswered, becomes history. Lesson 5. You cannot design for what you will actually build. Rockefeller built Standard Oil on kerosene for lamp fuel. Gasoline, his waste product, became the fuel that powered the century. The trust structure he invented to organize Standard Oil was immediately replicated across every major industry in America. The antitrust law that destroyed his company became the governance architecture of American commerce for 100 years. The university he funded almost accidentally became one of the world's great research institutions and has produced more than 100 Nobel laureates. The breakup that was designed to punish him tripled his fortune. He built for order and permanence. What he actually produced was transformation and consequence on a scale that operated entirely beyond his design or his intention. He built for order. He got history. Here is what the story finally comes back to. The government spent 5 years prosecuting John D. Rockefeller, won completely in the highest court in the land, and made him richer in the process. Not marginally richer. His fortune tripled in 24 months and continued growing until he became the first billionaire in American history. He outlived nearly every person who had ever stood in opposition to him. He outlived Roosevelt. He outlived Rogers. He outlived Archbold. He died in the spring in a house in Florida, 97 years old and still worth 1.5% of the entire American economy, a long way from a farm in Richford, New York, and a father who tried to cheat his own sons to make them sharp. The companies he built are still among the largest on earth: ExxonMobil, Chevron, BP. They extract more oil in a single year than Standard Oil produced across its entire history, through infrastructure whose organizing logic runs back to the pipelines Rockefeller laid across Pennsylvania and Ohio in the 1880s. The Rockefeller Foundation still operates with $6 billion in assets, still funding public health and agricultural development, and the things Rockefeller believed the wealthy had an obligation to address. Spelman College is still graduating women in Atlanta. The University of Chicago is still producing Nobel laureates. The rule of reason is still in the case law. Standard Oil controlled 90% of American refining in 1879. The government destroyed it in 1911. And today, sitting in the car you drove this morning, filling the tank at a station whose ownership chain traces back to a Cleveland refinery in 1863, you are still moving through the infrastructure of what John D. Rockefeller built. He called kerosene the poor man's light. The light you use today runs on different fuels, through different systems, by entirely different means. But the economy of energy, the pipeline logic, the antitrust framework that governs every market you buy from, all of it carries the fingerprints of a boy from Richford, New York, who sold candy piece by piece at 9, loaned money at interest at 12, recorded every cent in a ledger for the next 80 years, and built something so large that the government had to break it into 34 pieces, and even in pieces, it kept growing. If this story earned your time, leave a comment with the one thing that surprised you most. We read every single one, and if you want more stories like this, the next one is already waiting.